Right, this is the first time I'm trying to do this, so we're going to be looking at the verification principle. Okay, so the first thing you need to know about the verification principle, obviously, is we're dealing with religious language, and we're looking at the question about whether language has meaning or not. So this is in the first area of religious language. Now, this is associated mainly with a group of philosophers called the Vienna Circle, who were influenced largely by Wittgenstein. Now, the Vienna Circle was a group that pre-existed in the 1930s, but it's with the 1930s when they come up with the verification principle. Now, what they effectively were trying to set out was how could we be certain about things, and they were particularly looking at the analysis of language and sentence structure. Now, what they came up with was a branch of philosophy called the logical positivists. Now, at this time, it's Moritz Schlick who is the main leader and the supporter of this. Now, logical positivism effectively means that we can only be positive or certain about something if we have logic, if we have due reason to. And ultimately what they believed is that it wasn't the role of the philosopher to ask questions about the world, that was the role of the scientist. And effectively everything needed to go through some sort of filter where it needed to be verified in order for us to be able to say that that piece of sentence is meaningful. Otherwise it's not meaningful. Now, the verification principle works effectively on two different ways. Something has meaning if it can be verified either through a priori reasoning or through a posteriori. So, for instance, this sentence is obviously lacking in meaning. The sky, which is above me, is also orange tomorrow, but the clock says so. Now, what hopefully I've just done there is a bit of gibberish. So in terms of our sentence structure, you can recognise that that is meaningless. It doesn't make any sense. So we could say through a priori reasoning that that doesn't make sense. Or we could say that tomorrow it will either rain or it will not rain. So this is an example of something which through a priori reasoning we can suggest that this is true, and we know it's true, and it will always will be true. The second is a little bit more tricky, and is what we're interested in, which is the a posteriori. The idea that something has meaning if we know how to check it. Now, the verification principle isn't interested in whether something is true or false, it's simply interested in whether there is a method of verification. So the meaning of a sentence actually becomes the method of verification. So if we check something by looking at it, then its meaning is actually looking at it and checking it. Now, Schlick was a supporter of what we call the strong verification principle. Now, in this sense, we need to know something completely verifiable. So that's the key word there for strong, completely verifiable. Now, if something's completely verifiable, then obviously it's meaningful because we know exactly what it is that it's actually going to be doing. Now, an example here then would be, I suppose, similarly with the a priori, but anything which is temporal. So, for instance, the fact that I'm talking to the camera right now is verifiable. We know how to check it, therefore it's meaningful. Now, what they proposed was that all forms of religious language are not verifiable, therefore they are meaningless. They are not worthy of academic study. And the reason not worthy of academic study is because any sort of language like God is love, God is transcendent, there is absolutely no way of checking this. So the only way that we could possibly check those things is if we actually could see them, could see God, or see evidence of it, and we can't do that. Therefore, we should not be making those sorts of statements. Now, little check here. As well as, obviously, religious language, we'd also apply this for aesthetics, for ethics, and for, I suppose you could even include poetry there. It does not mean that Schlick did not say that he loved his wife. It's not that we shouldn't use this language, and the language perhaps isn't useful, but what he said was that in terms of for academic pursuit, it's unworthy of it. So in terms of as an academic discipline, philosophy, in particular the philosophy of language, should be leaving it well alone. Now, from this we get what we call the weak verification principle, which was supported by A.J. Ayer. Now, Ayer was an English philosopher, whereas obviously the Vienna Circle was from Austria. So he wasn't a member of the original group, but he popularised it and brought the verification principle to the English-speaking world with his book Language, Truth and Logic in 1936. Now, one of the main criticisms of Schlick that we'll look at again in a minute is that Schlick claimed that you had to verify something conclusively or completely. And this was very problematic, because ultimately the verification principle was trying to uphold science. But it didn't uphold science, because things like positive universals couldn't be verified. So whilst I could test a piece of metal to see whether it expanded when heated, I couldn't do it to all. So the maxim, all metals expand when heated, which is a common scientific fact and very useful, could not be verified. So by its own method of verification, it was meaningless. Now, Ayer took this and thought, well, we've got a bit of a problem. So he proposed something that we call the weak verification principle. Now, with the weak verification principle, effectively, all we need is to know something in principle. If we know that thing in principle, then he said that it was meaningful. We didn't need to conclusively verify everything. And his famous example was that of the moon. So in 1935, when he first put forward this idea, we did not know that there was a dark side of the moon. Now, Tom will obviously be very interested in this part of the lesson, as I'm sure you'll remember. We didn't know what was on the other side of the moon. But what he said was that it is verifiable in principle to say that there are mountains on the dark side of the moon, on the other side. Why? Because in 1935 we don't have the technology, but in principle we know how to. And if the meaning of something is knowing how to verify it, well, we can go round there and have a look. Now, we couldn't in 1935, but we actually can now. We know that whether it's true or whether it's not true. But the point is, all we need to know is in principle. So we don't need to be able to test every piece of metal to say all metals expand when heated. In principle, we can test every piece of metal. We can test the metal that we see in front of us and draw those conclusions, which is perhaps a more workable explanation. Now, some of the other criticisms from it. We've already talked about the fact of the positive universals, which is one of the major ones, particularly for the strong. If we just look at the weak verification, Keith Ward, his main criticism is that ultimately everything's verifiable in principle. So, for instance, God can verify himself. So when we say God is love, God is transcendent, then well, God knows it. So in principle, everything is meaningful and it doesn't exclude anything. Therefore, it's meaningless to actually use it. Hick, with his eschatological verification, says, well, we can actually verify it, but we can't do it right now, but at the end of the world. So for instance, if God is loving, then we'll know when we're with him in the end times. And if we don't know him, well, we won't know. But ultimately, it is verifiable, just not now, but in the afterlife. Other criticisms come from the fact that it seems to actually fail its own test. So if the verification principle needs to go through a sort of process of checking whether it is can be verified, how can we verify the verification principle? It's a circular argument or a circular fallacy. Therefore, we can't use its results if we can't actually check it itself. And Dowie said Phillips has also said that there was an error of understanding. Now, with the error of understanding, what he was suggesting was you're mixing up what should be used for scientific language for things like poetry, and you can't do that. You need to keep the two things separately. Philosophy or religious language is what religious language is, science is science and what science is. I think that's pretty much it. So, I hope that was helpful.